You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. If you've been listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast for any length of time, you've probably heard at least one episode where we've talked about wildlife management, specifically state wildlife management agencies and boards, and how they've been operating on the land and their attitude toward wildlife in general and predators specifically. And you might have noticed that each one of those episodes has ended in a little bit of disappointment over the lack of apparent things that we can do to stop it, to change it, to break up the consumptive interests boys club of trappers, trophy hunters, guides, and people who only see wildlife and wild lands as a place to play, hunt, and extract. And so it is with great pleasure that I have someone on today you're really going to want to take a listen to. Rick Steiner, who is a conservation biologist in Alaska and founder of Oasis Earth. He's been involved in the global conservation movement for 40 years. From 1980 to 2010, he was a marine conservation professor with the University of Alaska, stationed in the Arctic, Prince William Sound, and Anchorage, specializing in marine conservation, and worked on environmental effects of offshore oil, climate change, fisheries, marine mammals, shipping safety, habitat conservation, and conservation policy. After the university and the U.S. government pressured him to refrain from raising concerns about the risks and impacts of offshore oil development in Alaska, he resigned his tenured professorship in protest. Rick has received several conservation awards. The Guardian called him one of the world's leading marine conservation scientists and one of the most respected and outspoken academics on the oil industry's environmental record. He serves on the board of directors of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER, and the board of directors of the Ocean Foundation. He's delivered Oasis Earth, Planet in Peril as a public presentation for over 30 years in many venues around the world, and authored the book Oasis Earth, Planet in Peril, released in 2020. I'm super glad that you guys finally get to hear what I consider now a real, true, viable solution to the wildlife management practices in the U.S. by states.
The issue of state management of wildlife has been a thorny one and contentious one for decades, right? And very recently, as of the last administration and even into this one, some states have gone extreme in their desire to kill predators to enhance ranching or other ungulate population, moose and caribou and deer and things like that, elk. And they've gone to the extreme, sort of where we were maybe 50 years ago. In the lower 48, where wolves had been listed under the Endangered Species Act, that protection was eliminated during the previous federal administration, the Trump administration, and several of the groups that are participating in our proposed rulemaking had asked the secretary to reinstate that. She hasn't. She didn't. They're still pushing that issue. But even beside that and beyond that, it's not just an issue of state mismanagement of wolves, but it's also brown bears and black bears and mountain lions and coyote and such. Many of these states, primarily Western states, to some extent all states, but primarily the Western states, Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, Wisconsin, Idaho, to some extent Washington, and others have sort of reverted to this 1950s mentality about eliminating predators for other political objectives, and to protect ranchers and things, and sport hunters and trophy hunters, allowing them to get their elk and their deer and their moose where and when they want. And it just makes no scientific sense any longer. We've known this for quite a while. and it makes no ethical sense either. So our proposal, with a group of 25 conservation organizations, Native American organizations, and others, have proposed a rulemaking within the existing law to the Secretary of Interior that the Secretary would adopt a procedure by which they analyze and assess the eligibility of each state to receive, in total, about $1 billion a year is distributed through this federal program called the Pittman-Robertson Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration. Notice the key word there, restoration. Every year, the U.S. government collects these fees from, hunting taxes and ammunition taxes and things like that, and then distributes it to the states for their wildlife and fish restoration needs. But our proposal would make, for the first time, the Secretary determine that each of these states is actually doing its job. The Act actually requires that healthy populations of wildlife and without impinging on unmet needs for a diverse array of wildlife and associated habitats, and giving consideration to all wildlife. And the point is that, for instance, here in Alaska, they get maybe $50 million a year from these programs from the federal government, yet then turn right around and try to eliminate all wolves and bears in a particular area to enhance caribou and moose populations. In some cases, it has a slight upward tick in the ungulate population. In other cases, it has no impact at all, except in all cases, it destabilizes ecosystems. So our proposal would make the Secretary of Interior step forward, assert her authority in making certain that these states are doing the right job for balanced, natural, wild ecosystems. And if they're not, they don't get their federal aid every year. And that's a significant chunk of state game management budgets. In Alaska, it's the biggest chunk, I believe. And in many states, that's the case as well. So, if we can't do it through the legislative or judicial route, it can be done here through the rulemaking route. And it's a pretty straightforward process. The Secretary has it within her authority to adopt this as is, to decline it as is, or to adapt it and make it something that her and her Fish and Wildlife Service in the Department of Interior think will really enhance wildlife management, sustainable, wild, natural ecosystem balanced, predator-prey balanced wildlife management. So we're optimistic, but we've been pushing these issues for quite a while and have gotten little traction, even during the Obama administration. So we'll have to see.
I mean, there's just not a scientist or an unbiased party or biased at least toward wildlife protection and diversity to be found on any of these wildlife boards in any state.
Jack, that is exactly the problem. Wildlife management, generally called game management, that term is sort of a loaded term nationally, is co-opted and captured by hunting interests, consumptive use interests. For instance, here in Alaska, the Board of Game, which sets the take levels and the regulations and things like that, is comprised solely of hunters, trappers, and trophy hunters and guides, and that's it. There is no advocate for the tourism, watchable wildlife interest. There is no strict wildlife independent scientist on the board, and so the whole process is captured by a very narrow interest. We only have 15 to 20% of Alaskans actually have hunting and trapping licenses, right? But that is the only voice represented in wildlife management in the state. And that's the case in many states across the West, at least, and probably throughout the nation. So our proposed rule, which fortunately Rewilding Institute is one of our many, many organizations proposing that joined the petition to the Department of Interior, along with the Humane Society, the Center for Biological Diversity, Global Indigenous Council, United Tribes, Oasis Earth, Native Conservancy, many other groups, basically says, okay, these states are getting $1 billion distributed across the 50 states every year in federal wildlife and fish and wildlife restoration aid. Let's start conditioning that and make certain that these states are managing their wildlife, consistent with federal goals of healthy populations, balanced predator-prey relationships, and as balanced a wild ecosystem as possible. So part of the rulemaking does two things. It requires if it was adopted as we proposed, it would require a public comment period for each state application for federal aid, allowing stakeholders, particularly those that have been traditionally marginalized, which is tribes and subsistence users, tourism and watchable wildlife interests, independent scientists, conservationists, et cetera, to comment on whether a state is really behaving correctly and managing wildlife based on science, ethics, and public interest. And then based on that, the secretary, the director of Fish and Wildlife, and other staff will make a determination whether these states deserve to get their chunk of federal aid that year. And that's a pretty strong lever. I mean, if you start threatening the state of Alaska's $48 million chunk of federal aid for fish and wildlife restoration management every year, they're going to sit up and take notice. And otherwise, there is no particular hammer or leverage that we, the people of the United States, have over these rogue state wildlife management agencies. So, if the secretary should rely on best available science, each proposal from every state for this grant should be reviewed by an independent or at least a federal coalition of scientists to review it for its scientific efficacy. And then the secretary will make a decision. And I think, as it is right now, the way the state of Alaska is operating, and Idaho and Montana and Wyoming and Wisconsin, at least those would be found ineligible unless they clean up their act. And I think this will, if adopted as we've proposed, this would be one of the strongest, most progressive enhancements in national wildlife management in decades. And so we're hopeful and cautiously optimistic, but it depends on the politics back there in Washington. For instance, the secretary did not relist wolves in the lower 48. And I suspect that's probably due to pushback from the ranching interests and trophy hunting and sport hunting interests. But she is going to have to make a decision what is in the national interest here. And particularly given the president's 30 by 30 initiative, protecting 30% of national lands and waters by 2030, conserving these, this proposed rule fits well within that. And the notion of climate resilience in these stressed ecosystems, which are certainly, many of them are unraveling due to climate impacts and fire and drought and floods and heat. It's a whole new dynamic on these terrestrial ecosystems these days. So we need to give them the best resilient possible scenario. And the way to do that is to back off of this intense manipulation of predator-prey relationships. So Alaska has been horrible at this for decades, and we've tried to intervene in it, and they've spent millions of dollars, killed thousands of wolves, hundreds of brown bears and black bears, and in many cases it has not resulted in an increase in caribou and moose populations that they've been hoping for, expecting. And in some cases where it did increase caribou populations, they've then overgrazed, and and there's a problem there. So destabilizing ecosystems this way is a fundamentally bad idea.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Did you know we also publish insightful and inspirational content from leading rewilding scholars, poets, artists, and organizers from around the world? You can visit rewilding.org and sign up for our weekly digest to receive brilliant, fresh insights on everything rewilding. You'll find over a decade of articles and news from the front lines of wildlands protection and all kinds of restoration efforts. Check us out at rewilding.org, and don't forget to share it with friends.
Does any part of the proposal go after the issue of these wildlife management boards state by state, that there should be some density of scientists and more conservation minded people to balance out these things? Or will the effect of it, will it have a chilling effect on the number of people who typically man, and that's a key word, man these boards, just go away when they realize that the funding is now predicated upon what you've talked about would be included in this rule. So they're not going to have their, the way
sweet honey pot. Yeah.
The honey pot.
It's a very good point, Jack. And that, if I was the Secretary of Interior right now, I would be including that in any review of state eligibility for these huge amounts of federal aid going to states for wildlife restoration every single year. I would be looking at the balance of the state game management agency and its board, however it's structured right now, to make sure that it itself is balanced and representative of both the state political interests and national. And that would be a good thing for the Secretary. The Secretary could include that in a rulemaking. One thing we've proposed is that the Secretary examine in this rule, if it is adopted, examine any legislation in states that is contradictory to the national goals of sustainable, balanced ecosystems. And for instance, here in Alaska, they passed an intensive management law, the state legislature did 25 years ago or so, that requires predator control in certain situations. And then when we started raising this issue of Pittman-Robertson Fund 6 or 7 years ago, the administration went back to the legislature and set up a new fund by which they could fund out of their intensive management fund these predator control efforts. Those are strictly contradictory to the national goals of balanced, healthy, wild ecosystems and associated habitats that are found in the Act. So those laws alone should make Alaska ineligible. And there's other states, I think Idaho and Wisconsin both have laws right now that do much the same, seeking to eliminate wolves from broad, huge areas. Alaska's predator control programs seek to remove annually 100% of the wolves in these what they call wolf control areas. And again, it's not just wolf control; it's black bears. In Alaska, it has been brown bears, and elsewhere it can be coyotes and mountain lions and things. And so it's not just wolves, and it's not just one state. It would be a new standard of scientific and ethical management of wildlife in these states. And I love the idea of the Secretary including in the rulemaking, in the rule, to examine the balance of every state game management commission or board or agency to make sure that it's reflective of the interests of the state. And here in Alaska, it clearly is not. And in most states, it clearly is not. So that would be a good one. Yeah, I think it's a great thought.
You'd have to listen to a lot of episodes of Rewilding Earth podcast to know how many times we have talked about this issue and ended on a really sour note 100% of the time, shaking our heads, effectively not knowing what the heck do you do to break this tight grip that they have. And you're the first person to come on, and John Davis, our executive director, said that's exactly why we need to talk to you, because you guys are working on a solution, and Rewilding's there with you.
It's a great coalition of Native Americans, conservation groups, science, environmental groups, etc. Some big ones, Humane Society of the United States, Center for Biological Diversity. This intersects many of the issues that all these groups are concerned with. And this is a solution. If the Secretary did not want to relist wolves under the Endangered Species Act in the Northern Rockies, for instance, which apparently has been the decision till now, then this is a solution. This is science-based. It's popular. It's based on ethical treatment of wild animals, which is becoming a really strong, pervasive movement in the United States, and it's about time. The notion of wild animal suffering in traps, and I mean, there's been some absolutely egregious practices that these states have practiced. Like here in Alaska, they were for years putting radio collars on, darting wolves from helicopters, anesthetizing them, putting radio collars on them, letting them come back to consciousness, and then following the radio collar back to their den, and then going there and killing the entire family group, pack of the wolves. And they killed, scores of wolves in one particular area around Yukon Charlie National Preserve by that method. And then they've been going into dens and killing pups, and they've been permitting killing bears and cubs in dens, and using and elsewhere, and using dogs to hunt and things like some things that are kind of a throwback from 100 years ago. And it is time that we get beyond this. I don't think anybody throughout the United States would really condone many of the practices that have been used to ostensibly control, to kill predators. These are beautiful animals. They have an ethical right to exist, and they also have a very strong biological role in these wild ecosystems: mountain lions, wolves, brown bears, black bears, coyotes, and such. So what we're doing is these rogue states have been destabilizing ecosystems for very short-term objectives, without looking out for climate resilience and true stable wildlife ecosystems. And that's coming back to bite us all, I think. So this is a sublime way, we think, of the secretary doing this job, and not just for wolves, but also for these other predators, important predators. And I think she would look pretty good politically. I don't think anybody could. Some of these states will certainly strongly oppose this rule, and groups like the Safari Club and such will oppose it. But that's too bad. I mean, they are not the United States government, and we, the people, are. So I think we have an administration now that's going to be sensitive to this, and we're, as I said, we're cautiously optimistic that they will do some version of this.
Remind everybody what the percentage of the American public is considered under the hunting umbrella. Active.
Oh, I think it's just a few percent, actually, of the total. I mean, even here in Alaska, which is known for a hunting state, both subsistence sport and such, and guiding, it's an economy here, but, there's 15 to at most 20% of the state residents own hunting or trapping licenses. So it's a minority, without question.
So I'm thinking, somebody's thinking, listening to this, why isn't this already done? Why isn't it a slam dunk? We're talking about outside of Alaska, an extremely tiny minority of people.
Right.
And I also wanted to ask you, among that minority, how many hunters are just your run-of-the-mill regular subsistence, deer hunters, non-trophy hunters, certainly non-predator hunters? Do you know what possibly the breakdown is from there?
I wish I did, but I don't. But I think that's probably the majority, just people going out wanting to get a deer or something like that. And most hunters that we've talked to, both here in Alaska and outside, find these kind of predator control practices by these rogue states, egregious and abhorrent, and do not want them to continue because it paints all hunting with a black eye. Mm-hmm. And it certainly does. And so most of the hunters we've talked to don't want this stuff to go on, and they would support a reasonable rule from the Department of Interior that would sort of rein it in and give the secretary the ability to determine states' eligibility to receive this annual federal aid grant. But yeah, a lot of it's in the national. Here in Alaska, this is a good comparison. The economic value, there was an independent economic analysis done a few years ago. comparing the economic value of consumptive wildlife use, that is hunting and trapping and guiding, versus the tourism value, watchable wildlife use. And it found that the tourism watchable wildlife values were at least 2 times more than the consumptive hunting, trapping, guiding values to the state in terms of tens of thousands of jobs, tens of millions of dollars, actually over $1 billion. And it's an extremely valuable industry here, watchable wildlife, and they don't go together. Now, subsistence is another thing for our native villages and such like that, but that generally is not what we're talking about. We're talking about predator control. It's generally used to try to enhance trophy hunting and sport hunting access and take.
So we're talking about a small minority within a very small minority that is going to be affected in what they perceive, but isn't necessarily true, a negative way, because they have not proven that if they kill more predators, they get more deer, elk, moose, they get more of that. We in fact, we could probably prove that is not the case definitively now, because they've had free reign to conduct this empirical test for decades and decades, and they have not done anything except, if anything, brought up disease and other things. There's no
and overgrazing and other problems that should have been anticipated and but generally weren't. There's a classic case. There's the classic case of introducing mongoose into the big island of Hawaii, trying to control rats, and it was complete failure because mongoose were diurnal and the rats were nocturnal, and so the rats still kept doing what they were doing. The mongoose ate all the bird eggs, so it had the exact opposite effect that was desired. A more recent one is the Columbia River estuary, the mouth of the Columbia River between Oregon and Washington on the northwest coast of the U.S. The double-crested cormorants, there were thousands of them nesting on one island, and they were eating the out-migrant salmon smolt coming down the Columbia that are few and far between now because of the dams. And so the federal government went there, this was during the Obama administration, and killed every cormorant they could, shot them, destroyed their nests, killed thousands, over 5,000 double-crested cormorants. This is in 2015, 2016, 2017 as a predator control program. And then and destroyed all their nests. And what happened is the surviving cormorants moved upriver about 7 or 8 miles to just near the Astoria Bridge. And the end effect has been they are consuming 3 times the number of salmon smolt out migrating through the river as they were down at East Sand Island, because there was more mix of marine prey down closer to the ocean system. And so it had the exact opposite effect that was desired. And this is often what we get into with these predator control programs. They're sort of monochromatic, limited in creative scientific thinking and anticipating scenarios and results, and they generally do not work for the desired goal. Plus, they're highly unethical. People don't support this kind of thing anymore. They didn't really 100 years ago, but they certainly don't in the 21st century here. So it needs to stop. And this is a tool by which the Secretary of Interior can do so, and also accomplish some more progressive enhancements in wildlife management, such as you mentioned earlier, that a more balance requiring states to have a more representative management board for wildlife and fish. And that would be a big one in itself. So.
Okay, so what would be the material difference to the vast majority of hunters if this rule is passed and instated? What's their life going to be like as hunters from that point forward? Is it going to just be totally horrible, like they're going to say in all their magazines? And
well, they will certainly. The state, they're fond of claiming federal overreach when it suits their purposes, but this is a federal grant. It's going to be a hard one for them to claim that in this one. This is hundreds of millions of dollars $1 billion being distributed amongst the states from the federal government. And the federal government attaches stipulations to other federal aid programs like transportation, roads, our foreign aid, our USAID budgets and aid given to other developing countries often comes with strategic adjustment stipulations asking a recipient government to do certain things. That's all this is.
Yeah.
And it's time that the U.S. government started asserting its muscle here and making sure that states manage wildlife sustainably and ethically and equitably. And I think the average hunter will see no impact of this other than potentially a more stably managed predator-prey relationship in their ecosystems, a healthier terrestrial wildlife ecosystem, and thus perhaps a more stable access to their hunting targets here in the future instead of these wild swings. We're going to suffer some of them anyway because of climate change and fire and drought and flood, which we're already seeing in many places. But this will be a way of actually, hopefully, evening these systems out through the climate chaos of this century. And otherwise, it's going to be very chaotic.
There's no harm, and there is a great possibility that the hunters experience, the regular hunters, non-trophy, bloodlusting wolf haters. Those guys are not hunters to begin with, and hunters will be the first to say that, and are.
That's
and
right.
have.
Yeah.
But there's not going to be any material change in their experience, and a possible great benefit or set of cascading benefits of that balance that you talk about in their hunting experience. Right. And I wanted to bring this out because you could hear 1,000 conservation biased podcasts talk about this issue and never mention what it's really going to mean for hunters. And I think that's huge oversight because, while it might sound, and it would if they left it out, if we left this part out, it would sound like we just want to get rid of hunting and we hate hunters. In fact, a lot of members of Rewilding Institute are hunters, a lot. Sure. And it's because the actual real hunters, also include conservation mindset and a land ethic in their worldview. And those guys are going to benefit by this. If nothing else, they won't see any, negative impacts from this. And the only people that we're rooting against are those really radical fringe hunters, in air quotes, hunters, that want to just wipe out things on a sort of psychopathic level.
Well, you mentioned the word there, and there is a strange psychopathology involved in this hatred, primarily of wolves, but all predators. And I think it goes back to our Paleolithic ancestry or somewhere, but it still carries through. And there's a very small percentage of people in this country, very small, that just hate wolves and bears and mountain lions and
coyotes
and hate those of us that like them and support balanced predator-prey ecosystems. They hate the federal government. They hate parks. And so that unfortunately, they have been running the show. The inmates are running the asylum there in that case. And so I think most hunters are not only going to see no negative impact of this rulemaking, the positive impact will be a more stable predator-prey relationship, more stable access to their prey that they're wanting to hunt. And they're going to feel a heck of a lot better about it, knowing that the states are not out there flying around in helicopters shooting wolves and brown bears. They're going to feel more pride about what it is they do, and that's a tangible asset. I think right now there's a lot of people in the hunting community I know here in Alaska that are just downright ashamed of how this state has managed wildlife, and I think it's the case. I know it's the case elsewhere in these western states. It's a chance for the secretary to assert the national interest here, and which is withholding these funds from these states that don't want to do the right thing, don't want to comply with the federal goals of stable, healthy, balanced ecosystems. And if they want to keep doing their nasty predator control program, then they don't get their federal aid. And that's going to they're not going to do that for long. I can promise you. So.
To our listeners, what you're hearing today, if you've been following the podcast for a while, you'll know that this is the first time we've ever had something like this to discuss that is viable, that is doable, and can actually solve a problem we've been wringing our hands over for years and years and years, and talked about with many different experts here on the podcast to very little avail. Like we don't really come up with like, how are we going to do that? I don't know. And then we go away and worry some more about it. This can actually solve the entire thing with wildlife boards and agencies.
So. Yeah.
And so to that end, I know Rewilding and all the other groups, this coalition that you've been discussing, what else can people do? What can listeners do? And by the way, at rewilding.org/POD, you will find this podcast. And at the end of every podcast, we have an extra credit section. In this one, we're going to have lots of juicy things that you can do to take action to help support what Rick's been talking about today. But other than those things we know will be there, what can people do? What should people be looking out for?
Well, certainly it would be worth sending a note, public opinion message or something to the Secretary of Interior, encouraging her to adopt in its entirety the proposed rulemaking that this coalition of groups has proposed, and to include in it such issues that you've brought up, Jack, the issue of the Secretary making certain that every state has a representative wildlife management system that represents the interests, all of the major stakeholder interests of the state. And then when and if the Secretary does propose this rule, it will be issued in the Federal Register. There will be a public comment on the proposed rule. There'll be some opposition. I think we know where that will come from the states themselves and from big special interest groups like the Safari Club and the NRA and such like that. But that will be a time to really rally some support for the strong rule within the existing law. I mean, the other option was to go to Congress and amend the Pittman-Robertson Act, but that's a whole morass that none of us really wanted to wade through at this point, and probably less probable of an outcome. So this one, it doesn't change. It changes the rules that implement the existing Pittman-Robertson law. And I think if the Secretary does propose this, we need to weigh in heavily in support of it. And then if it's adopted, hopefully when it's adopted, every time a state such as Wisconsin, Colorado, Idaho, California, Texas, Alabama, proposes to the federal government, to the Department of Interior, a grant for a large annual receipt of federal aid for wildlife management, the public will then have the opportunity to comment on how that state is actually doing in its overall wildlife management regime. Is it complying with the letter and intent of the act? Is it complying with what we all know to be ethical wildlife management standards throughout the nation? And then the Secretary will make a determination, and I can guarantee you that many of these states, several of them, will be ineligible under the guidance that we have proposed. So hopefully, for right now, weigh in, send a letter to the Secretary of Interior. There's a few petitions up online. Center for Biological Diversity has one. I think some have closed. Humane Society of the U.S. has another one. And join those, sign on to those. But sending direct notes to the Secretary of Interior might be the more impactful. The other option would be to send notes to your congressional representatives and senators if they might be sympathetic to this issue, and get them to weigh in with the Secretary, saying that they're hearing from a lot of their constituents that this is a good idea. Please go ahead and propose this and adopt it if reasonable. So,
Rick, I really appreciate the work you're doing. I appreciate taking the time to come here today, because this has got to be one of the biggest episodes ever for me personally, just because this has been nagging me And so many, basically everybody who knows anything about the issue, we've all been dying to hear somebody say there's a real possible solution here, and it's not far-fetched. And you did that today.
It's not at all.
I thank you so much.
I thank you so much for your encouragement, and also, again, for Rewilding Institute joining the coalition along with all these other wonderful, forward-thinking problem solvers in the proposed rulemaking. So we're going to follow this closely, and there's been a meeting with the Secretary of Interior, and we're cautiously optimistic. So we will keep you posted, and all of your members and listeners posted as well.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/pod.